Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us today. I apologize for the delay due to some technical difficulties. My name is Tamanna Salikuddin, Director for South Asia Programs at the U.S. Institute of Peace. USIP is this country's national, nonpartisan, independent institute founded by Congress and dedicated to the proposition that a world without violent conflict is possible, practical, and essential for U.S. and global security. Please feel free to join our discussion today by leaving us questions on the USIP event page in the chat function. Today, we will be discussing Kashmir, an area that is central to stability in South Asia and is often can be the spark between the two nuclear powers of India and Pakistan. Famously, President Bill Clinton in 2000 called it the most dangerous place in the world. This month, last year, in 2019, significant changes took place in Kashmir that have reverberated not only in Kashmir, but in the whole region. At the end of July 2019, there were rumors abounding in Jammu and Kashmir that changes were afoot. However, there was no information about what was going on. Tourists were evacuated. The famous Hindu pilgrimage to Vaishno Devi was abruptly cut short. External journalists were asked to either leave the valley or stay in a designated location. Hundreds of local politicians, civil society activists, and others were preemptively arrested. Security forces flooded the area. Something was definitely going to happen. I happened to be flying from New Delhi to Srinagar that morning of August 5th. Communications had been cut off from Kashmir, and we had no way of finding out what was happening. When we landed on the ground in Srinagar, we found out that on August 5th, 2019, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the Indian government made an unprecedented change to the country's constitution to revoke the autonomy provisions for the state of Jammu and Kashmir, to split it off from the territory of Ladakh, and to downgrade it both from statehood to union territories. Since then, there's been a significant crackdown on political and civic freedoms in the Kashmir Valley, and this has drawn some substantial international scrutiny. Overall, the sudden unilateral changes in Kashmir's status may be one of the most consequential developments in the region. Today, we are joined by two excellent scholars to discuss what do these changes mean for India, Pakistan, for Kashmiris, and the region. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Happymon Jacob, who's an associate professor of diplomacy and disarmament at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. He's a columnist with The Hindu, and he hosts a weekly show on the national security at thewire.in. He's the author of many books, and he has recently published on the USIP website, you can find it, a special report entitled Toward a Kashmir Endgame, How India and Pakistan Could Negotiate a Lasting Solution. I'd like to turn it over to Happymon to discuss his report and talk about the significance of these events 1 year later.
Thank you, Tamanna. Delighted to join this panel with you and Samir. As you correctly said, I think this is an important discussion. Kashmir, and I agree with you, Kashmir is central to India-Pakistan relations, stability between India-Pakistan relations, and stability in South Asia, as it were, be it as far as conflict escalation or peace building. Kashmir is central to the region. So to begin with, what I will do is that the paper that you referred to, Tamanna, that I wrote for USIP recently, I just sort of briefly tell you what my major arguments are in the paper. As all of us know, there has been a lot of discontent in Kashmir since August 2019, when the Indian government sort of read down Article 370 of the Indian Constitution, which basically meant that taking away the special status that was given to Jammu and Kashmir, the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir, and split it into two union territories, bringing them directly under the jurisdiction of the federal government in New Delhi. I think the second point that I'm making in the paper is that there is very little appetite. If you look at the statements coming out of New Delhi officials or politicians, there is very little appetite for any engagement. The Indian government has basically closed off all options for a negotiated settlement of Kashmir with Pakistan or the dissident parties within Jammu and Kashmir. So New Delhi seems to, the strategy seems to, is to sort of tighten control in Kashmir while creating space for more pro-India, quote unquote, politics in Jammu and Kashmir. But this approach, I argue in the paper, has intensified the disaffection while opening the door for more increased political interference by the Pakistani side. The third point that I'm trying to make is that the Pakistani side has responded by sort of putting together a certain strategy which basically accuses India, or rather Kashmir shame India in international forums by violating or accusing India of violating the Shimla Agreement of 1972. As all of you know, this is one of the foundational agreements as far as India, Pakistan, and the management of Jammu and Kashmir is concerned. I also argue in the paper that these mutually exclusive and highly militarized strategies have the potential to dangerously re-escalate. I say re-escalate because we keep seeing escalation between the two sides, re-escalate tensions between India and Pakistan. And finally, I'd conclude the paper with a positive note. And I argue that although bilateral attempts at conflict resolution in Kashmir seem very unlikely in the near future, both sides may eventually come to see the advantage of talking to each other. And as and when the time is ripe, I argue in the paper that perhaps the two sides could potentially revisit the so-called Kashmir formula that was negotiated through the back channel between the two sides through interlocutors from 2004 to 2007. Now, the one question that I'm trying to ask in this presentation is whether New Delhi has a theory of victory or an end game in Kashmir. If yes, what does that look like? Now, let me sort of take you through some of the aspects of this end game or theory of victory as far as New Delhi is concerned. And I sort of talk about four strategies that New Delhi is adopting in Jammu and Kashmir in detail. I just basically tell you what some of them are. The first strategy seems to be sidelining the moderate separatists in Kashmir, like the Hurriyat Conference, etc., etc. And mainstream politicians in Jammu and Kashmir, as many of you know, several of the mainstream political leaders are still in detention, like the former Chief Minister Mehbooba Mufti is in detention. Two of the former Chief Ministers, Farooq Abdullah and Omar Abdullah, were just released a few months ago from detention. So this is one way of sidelining the mainstream political parties in Kashmir. And second strategy seems to be creating a new political formation in the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir and creating new political narratives within Kashmir. Now, clearly, there are new political demands today. For example, the new political party that was inaugurated earlier this year, the Apni Party, or our own party, roughly translated, is seeking not for the restoration of Article 370 or the special status, but it is seeking that New Delhi should restore statehood to Jammu and Kashmir and not keep Jammu and Kashmir under the federal administration, as it were. So new political formations, new political narratives, new political demands, as it were. The third strategy seems to be to sort of shift the focus. And New Delhi has always found it that it is not fair that all the focus comes to Kashmir and there is very little focus on what it calls the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir and the northern areas, as it were. So it seems to be today deflecting much of the attention that is on Jammu and Kashmir to the unsettled status of the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. So the Indian side have been making this argument that we will talk about Kashmir, yes, the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, not on the question of Jammu and Kashmir. The fourth strategy is sort of to slowly and steadily withdraw the restrictions that have been imposed in Jammu and Kashmir. And if we have time later on during the Q&A, I can talk more about these restrictions. Now, the question is, what are these? What can these strategies adopted by the government of India do in Kashmir, and what is it that they cannot do in Kashmir? Now, let's sort of try and analyze these strategies. I think looking at these strategies, one thing is very clear, that these strategies are clearly unilateral in nature. The government of India does not seem to take on board the popular demands of the Kashmiris, the disaffected Kashmiris in Srinagar or in South Kashmir, as it were. these strategies also do not take on board the Pakistani sensitivities on the question of Kashmir. What is also important to note is that New Delhi's vision at this point of time for Kashmir, or the end game for Kashmir, is a short-term one. It's a tactical one to contain violence and to manage the narrative. That's about it. It is not thinking in terms of how this is going to pan out in the years to come. So to that extent, I would argue that New Delhi's Kashmir policy is clearly tied to the ruling party, Bharatiya Janata Party's understanding of domestic politics in India and how Kashmir potentially could feed into their own domestic political fortunes, as it were. To the extent that this is a non-conciliatory and winner-takes-all theory of victory that New Delhi has adopted in Kashmir, I would argue that this potentially could have long-term negative implications for India's approach to Kashmir. There seems to be no grand strategic plan in New Delhi, the way I see it, to pacify Kashmiri sensitivities, and no appetite to sort of set it in the traditional sense of the term, the Kashmir conflict with the Pakistani side. Let me also briefly summarize, now that I don't have too much time, maybe I have 2 minutes. So I will summarize also the Pakistani strategies as I see them. As I said earlier, one of the major planks of the Pakistani strategy seems to be to Kashmir shame India in various international forums and coordinate condemnation of India with regard to Kashmir in various international forums. It hasn't really met with much success, I would argue. You probably have Malaysia, Turkey, China, and Iran joining up this bandwagon, but there isn't much support from elsewhere. The second, I think, strategy is a very, very crucial one. There seems to be conversation in Islamabad, certainly in interactive circles that I'm part of, that Pakistani officials seem to be arguing, former officials seem to be arguing, that by having done what it has done in Kashmir, New Delhi has basically made the Shimla Agreement of 1972 null and void. Now remember, Shimla Agreement is one of the foundational agreements as far as India and Pakistan is concerned to manage the line of control between the two sides on the in Kashmir, etc. So if the Shimla Agreement is not valid anymore, this would have severe implications for line of control, etc. The third aspect is to sort of increase the heat as far as India is concerned in Kashmir by sending in more infiltrators across the line of control, by engaging in more firing. When infiltration happens, there will be counter firing, and to sort of coordinate among various terror groups like the LET or Hizbul Mujahideen, or even the new formations that you're looking at in Kashmir as far as terrorist organizations are concerned. So there's more coordination among terror groups in the valley. I think the underlying logic seems to be that you create more pressure for India in Kashmir, and the Indians will perhaps come to the negotiating table on the Kashmir question and give up its zero-sum sort of approach to Kashmir. The trouble with that argument, of course, is that Mr. Modi is certainly not going to be deterred by increased violence in Kashmir. So unless and until there is a spillover effect of what happens in Kashmir to the heartland of India, I don't think this is going to really work that way. Tamanna, do I have more time, or should I leave it and come back during?
Maybe I'll come back to you in the question and answer, Happymon. So
sure,
thank
absolutely.
you very much for the presentation. So I'd like to now turn it to Dr. Samir Lalwani, who has also authored a great piece for us as a special report available on USIP's website called India's Kashmir Conundrum, Before and After the Abrogation of Article 370. Samir is a senior fellow and director of the South Asia program at the Stimson Center, where he researches nuclear deterrence, interstate rivalry, crisis behavior, and counterinsurgency. He has done extensive research on South Asian national security decision-making, including fieldwork in India, in Kashmir specifically, in Pakistan, and in Sri Lanka. Samir, I'd love to hear from you. You know, Happymon really laid out the India-Pakistan aspect of this, but what we don't often hear is what is actually happening in Kashmir by the Kashmiris. And I think your paper does an excellent job of exploring that. So over to you, Samir.
Great. Thank you, Tamanna, and to all the USIP team and the Asia team at USIP for making this possible for this event and for our reports, which I really enjoy working on. And I'd be remiss if I did not mention my co-author, Jillian Gaynor, who was an instrumental part of producing this report and doing the research with me and writing the report. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here today. She, after completing the research on this product, moved into government and so is unable to participate, but deserves as much credit as I. So let me unpack a little bit, like maybe three elements, and some of it will intertwine with what Happymon said. Some will be a little distinct. So the first is how we got here. The second, I'll try to talk a little bit about what happened post the abrogation 370 post August 5th, and then briefly also touch upon like the end game strategy as I see it, from my vantage point, thousands of miles away. But the first part I think is pretty interesting is how India got to this point where it had to make such a enormous, extraordinary decision. Looking at the trajectory of violence and politics in Kashmir over the last 30 years, in fact, you were seeing a pretty significant improvement from the period of 2003 to 2012. Ceasefire agreement was signed, violence was steadily declining, militancy was also in the decline. There was significant progress in the composite dialogue and back channel discussions. And at the same time, around 2012, the former RAW director and special envoy on this, A.S. Phillips, warned that this calm that we were seeing in 2012, at the end of 2012, where there was sort of the greatest lull in violence, he said the calm appears deceptive. And he elaborated on this, that there are militant organizations were being degraded, but public attitudes in the valley really hadn't changed substantially. There were very few political concessions that were being offered. There was still a lot of centralized control, even though with a velvet glove on top, lots of corruption within the administrative state of Kashmir. And there were very sort of distinct sort of moments of flare-up that were alarming, I think, for political leaders both in Srinagar as well as in New Delhi in 2008 and 2010, where you had these big street protests with young teenagers going out into the streets for various sort of, the incitement sort of started from one thing, but really galvanized over the course of just the interactions of street protests and violence. And this was also reflected in a major survey that was done by Chatham House back in 2010. It's probably the last big sort of comprehensive survey that was done of both the Valley, Jammu, and Ladakh as well, and also Pakistan's administered Kashmir as well. And what that study found is it's interesting because both governments sort of latched onto the findings that they thought were useful, right? So it was very true that there was a lot of rejection of violence and militancy amongst people in the Kashmir Valley, certainly in Jammu as well, and also rejection of accession to Pakistan. But there was simultaneously a lot of disaffection when it came to the Indian state as well, and a great deal of public support for whatever it means to say Azadi, or to be supportive of some sort of separatist or quasi-autonomous political objective. And that never really changed. And following sort of this lull in violence from 2012, the violence trajectory started rebounding. And it wasn't just armed insurgent violence, it's something that we discussed in the report as we call mass quasi-violent resistance. It is a type of resistance that occupies a spectrum between organized armed insurgency and nonviolent civil resistance. Some people call this unarmed collective violence. Consists of activities like stone pelting, interdiction of security operations, and attendance of militant funerals. And look, to be honest, it's partly because of the political opportunity structure afforded to Kashmiris in India. This type of quasi-violent behavior, if it were to occur in a very authoritarian state, would be immediately quashed with barrel bombs and bullets and large-scale firepower. In India, that's not the case. There is an effort or an effort to be restrained by the security forces and by even the military forces. And so as a result, you have this sort of strange in-between space where public, civilians who are unarmed are confronting security forces with stones and other forms of interdiction to express resistance, but also to inhibit and interdict their capacity to conduct security operations. So it's a unique form of violence. We call it quasi-violence. And what we saw was when we were tracking the data on this through a lot of different data sources, that you were seeing sort of an increasing trajectory over time. It really, this type of activity certainly appears in the mid-2000s, flares up in 2008 and 2010, but really starts to pick up after 2013 along with armed insurgency, and spikes around the time in 2016 around the death of Lalwani, which suggests sort of some sort of connection with armed insurgency. It's not synonymous. It's not, these are not armed insurgents. This is a much more widespread and sort of public citizen activity, but at the same time, it seemed to have some sort of in tandem effect. At the same time, armed insurgency was also increasing during this period. Quasi-violence was related to it, but the insurgent groups were, or the insurgent participants were much more locally embedded, educated, personally motivated, and popularly supported. In the literature on insurgency and civil war, they had greater social endowments. And that meant, though, that they were a little less militarily effective, but they seemed to galvanize a much broader movement. Co-occurring with that was something that was also interesting that we tracked in the report, which was voter turnout. There was diminishing voter turnout, certainly in National Assembly elections. In state assembly elections, it started plateauing, and I think part of the reason why they didn't have state assembly elections when they were supposed to have them is because there was a high expectation that it would be voter turnout would be very low. The last panchayat elections, the turnout always is sort of obfuscated because you sort of aggregate all turnout from Jammu and Ladakh and the valley. But when you just look at the valley, it was pretty astonishing how low the turnout was. And the fact that 65% of seats were uncontested altogether. So it suggested that there was diminishing support for the democratic institutions that had been established and sort of meticulously established, I'd say, sort of in the 90s, they were starting to atrophy and people were losing faith in them. And so this is all to say that these trend lines were sort of were quite poor for India going into August of 2019. But these things don't just disappear with the sudden sort of change in the constitution, right? So part of the reason we go into detail explaining this is because these networks might atrophy, but the motivations that were driving them might not only remain, but fester, as Happymon talked about. So the next point I just want to briefly touch on is what happens after 370. There are two general predictions that come out, at least from the political apexes in the region. So one is this idea there's going to be significant mass violence, a bloodbath, as Imran Khan discussed it, and mass genocide. And the other was sort of, promise that it would be a return to normalcy within a few months by, particularly by Home Minister Amit Shah. So there's no mass violence because the Indian state is actually quite formidable and familiar with counterinsurgency and how to conduct this apparatus effectively. They preemptively arrested most of sort of the nodes of these networks that were able to generate whether armed or quasi-violent resistance. They shut down communications and freedom of movement, which really interdicted the capacity for coordination and protest. And it was it sort of threw a lot of resources as the Indian government is capable and prone to do. So it's a very resource-intensive commitment to keep a lid on this activity. At the same time, there was no return to normalcy because of continuing fear and distrust and a lack of compliance. So there's lots of political resistance that's probably bubbling below the surface. The few reports that come out through journalism and even through think tank reports like those published by ORF suggest that there is a lot of animosity and disaffection, as Happymon said, and also insufficient follow-through on state promises of economic injections and investment. Now, part of this is a result of the COVID pandemic, but a lot of this was visible even prior to the lockdowns that took place in April. So I think I'd liken this, and the analogy I use is a software virus. You can hit the restart button on your computer, but if the software has a virus, it's not going to disappear. And in this case, I think that was what I would expect, and what a report sort of predicts is that you'll see the resumption of this. It might be more effectively contained because there's a much more suppressive state capacity in the area, and they might sort of use more drastic measures to constrain it. But it's likely that stuff is festering. So briefly on where we're going in the end game. I think there are basically, there's essentially one broad strategy with a lot of different tactics, which is, it seems to me that they're trying to implement a violence management strategy with injections of money to spread amongst political elites. As Happymon said, sideline sort of the old political players, bring in and elevate new ones, compliant political parties with a heavy security force presence, and have some exercise of remote control from Delhi. There are two elements I think are disconcerting that are also potentially going to bolster this. One is political engineering, or gerrymandering, as we would call it in the United States, through the delimitation of new assembly constituencies. And the idea would be that you'd be able to sort of have a thin majority even run out of Jammu with mostly BJP or BJP affiliates or allies. But the other is maybe more long-term revolutionary strategy of demographic engineering. And here, the data is really unclear. It's very hard to discern what's actually going on. Obviously, not being there, it's hard to see. But if this is certainly something that Kashmiris on the ground fear, and one manifestation of this is through the domicile law. But that would obviously take many years. It's not something that can be again happen overnight. So in general, I think these sort of amount to indefinite containment strategies. You're not going to change mass sentiment and sort of allay the sentiment for resistance or some sort of autonomy or separatism. It's only it would take, if it does erode, it would take decades to do it, which means in the conclusion, I think that India seems likely to be bogged down, pouring political, economic, and security resources into Kashmir for years to come.
Thanks so much, Samir. Both your papers are so interesting and have so much to unpack and discuss. So I hope we can get into some of that discussion here. And I welcome the audience to add their own questions on the USIP website. You both talked about a little bit about what India's sort of plan was going into this and why they came to this unilateral decision. It was unpopular within Kashmir, but in the rest of India, it was highly popular. It was welcomed. Even members of the opposition Congress Party supported the revision of Article 370, and if there was any critique, it was on how it was done. And they laid out some justifications, controlling the militancy, limiting Pakistan's influence, creating space for more pro-Delhi politics, stopping corruption, and bringing development and investment to Kashmir. I want to ask you both, how do you think they've done? Have they reached any of these stated goals? And specifically, I do want to focus on the democratic institutions that you both raised. Have they actually been able to create some credible politics that is pro-Delhi by, even with the arrest and continued detention of many of, Kashmiri politicians? And related to that is the suppressive state capacity that Samir mentioned. I mean, what is the end game? I mean, does it just remain at that level? How do they actually see themselves easing out? Some critics have said within India that they jumped in very quickly, but that there isn't necessarily a way out. So I welcome your thoughts on India's goals.
Should I go
Happymon?
first? Right. Thank you, Tamanna. The other day I wrote an article in the Hindu in which I sort of made the argument that there has been this national myth making in India about Kashmir. And my argument essentially was that, the reason why there is this widespread acceptance in India about what was done in Kashmir last year in August was because for so many years, for so many decades, and not just the BJP government, but also successive Congress governments and others have made this sort of narrative that Article 370 is the mother of all problems as far as Kashmir is concerned, number one. And number two, Kashmir is being bankrolled by the taxpayers' money in the rest of India. And I basically argue that both of these arguments are basically nonsensical. The fact of the matter is that there is a lot of money that is going into the government of Jammu and Kashmir, but not to the economy of Jammu and Kashmir. In fact, the economy of Jammu and Kashmir is doing pretty well. In fact, doing much better than the other Indian states, as it were, thanks to the land reforms that was undertaken by Sheikh Abdullah and all of that kind of stuff. So, this was a misconception, as it were. And secondly, Article 370 is the mother of all problems. If anything, Article 370 ensured that there was less disaffection in Jammu and Kashmir. In any case, Article 370 was basically what was left of Article 370 was a skeleton by the time it was abrogated or watered down last year. So I think the reason why, as you correctly pointed out, there was this overwhelming support in India for the government's move last year was, I think, created by this sort of a background of a myth making, of the national myth making that we had. You asked about the credibility of local politics in Jammu and Kashmir. I mean, there are two ways of looking at it. One could put it, you look at the present and you would say, well, there is little credibility for mainstream politicians as it is in Jammu and Kashmir. The National Conference, the People's Democratic Party, the Congress Party, all of them stand, very little, all of them have very little support in Jammu and Kashmir to begin with. Even the dissident parties, like the Hurriyat Conference, they have lost their support among the population. The only guy who had some support among the population in South Kashmir was Gilani, who's just retired, and he's basically stepped down from the leadership of the Hurriyat Gilani faction. So politics in general, mainstream politics in general, hasn't had much support among the Kashmiris. Now comes the new politics and new narrative that the government of India is supporting in the shape of Happy Party, for instance. So that would have much less, salience and credibility within Kashmir. So that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that, wait, in politics, anything is possible. I mean, you never know 2 years down the line, supposing the Apni Party is able to negotiate a deal with New Delhi and say, all right, listen, we negotiated a deal with New Delhi and brought back statehood to Jammu and Kashmir. And if you create that sort of a narrative in Kashmir, they will basically end up having some support in Kashmir and in Jammu. So while there is an overwhelming lack of support for mainstream politics in general, within the mainstream political camp, you may have ups and downs of various factions. In any case, the Kashmiris have always believed that the mainstream political parties in Kashmir were collaborators with New Delhi, etc., etc. Now, the third point about what's the way out for New Delhi. Now, I argue that this was easier. It was easy to take that decision. It was a very popular decision. It was easy to take that decision. It was slightly more difficult to implement that decision, right? I mean, you had to sort of, as Amir pointed out, a great deal of security presence had to be ensured. You had to detain political leaders, the stormtroopers, etc., etc. So implementing that decision was slightly harder. Now, in the long run, the difficult part is to sustain that decision, to sustain those major constitutional changes that have been taken, that have been taking place in Jammu and Kashmir. So there is absolutely no easy way out of it. So my own feeling is that what the BJP has done in Jammu and Kashmir is clearly linked to its own domestic political agenda, as it were. Now, clearly, there is the ideological element to what has happened in Kashmir, etc. But from a purely from a strategic point of view, even from a medium-term point of view, if New Delhi is not able to pacify the population in Jammu and Kashmir, the people in Jammu and Kashmir, the agitators in Jammu and Kashmir, I think my own prediction is that it would make New Delhi to sort of come back to the negotiating table through the back channel, perhaps with some of the Kashmiri leaders, including the dissident parties, and even with the Pakistanis, as it were. So I think there is a way out, and the way out is simply, in my understanding, and I'll stop with that. What are the Pakistanis saying at this point of time? The Pakistanis have said in many ways that, listen, we don't care about your Article 370 nonsense. We never believed that you gave any special status to the Kashmiris. That was basically an excuse, a bahana. So let's sort of cut this nonsense. The Kashmiris are saying, so what we are, the Pakistanis saying, what we are concerned about is you are changing the borders of Jammu and Kashmir in some ways by making it a union territory. So statehood, withdrawal of statehood, or undoing of statehood is a major piece in that sort of argumentation between India and Pakistan. So if the Pakistanis are saying that, listen, talk about the statehood, restore the statehood, many Kashmiris are also making that argument, at least certainly in the mainstream political ecosystem, the argument is that return the statehood. New Delhi has not ruled out the returning of statehood. Both Home Minister Amit Shah and Prime Minister Narendra Modi have on various occasions said that we are open to restoring statehood when the time comes. So there is a common minimum, agenda, as it were, as far as all three parties are concerned, in my opinion. That, to my mind, is perhaps the opening, as it were. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Happymon. Samir, I want to turn to you with a little bit of a different question. We often, when we talk about Kashmir, we talk about India is doing this and Pakistan is doing this. I want to focus more on the Kashmiris themselves, who are disaffected largely from India because of the, as you both know in your papers, the large security presence, what they see as suppression of communications, media, politicians, human rights violations. in talking to Kashmiris, they say there are, some militants, but India is treating us as if we are all 7 million terrorists. On the other side, there's not necessarily a huge love of Pakistan either. So what is the situation on the ground right now for Kashmiris, and especially with COVID and continued suppression of some communications? And what is the the rate of disaffection, and how do they see a way forward?
So this is a very good question, Tamanna, and maybe it dovetails with something I was going to say in the previous one, so I'll try to combine the two. But like the simple fact is, I don't know for a fact, right? I haven't been there on the ground in a while, and I think the problem oftentimes is that most people don't talk to Kashmiris, not just the ones in Srinagar, but in South Kashmir or around the valley, and frankly, Muslims in Jammu as well, and the broader community in Jammu. So I think there needs to be a greater premium on paying attention to the voices that are coming out of these regions to understand what their grievances and expectations and sort of sources of disaffection are. From my limited vantage point, from what I've read and for like people I have talked to, I think there is a great deal of frustration at sort of the lack of agency. Right? And this is sort of, that you see this happen in lots of places around the world, where sort of the initial sort of sources for rebellion are sort of the belief that you don't have control over your own political life, economic life, freedom of movement, access, opportunity. And so there is some sort of grievance, but that has also metastasized because of experiences of violence. There's a really interesting paper that was published in an international organization by a couple of scholars that basically did some research in the valley and found that sort of censuses of the exposure to violence, when Kashmiris are exposed to violence, that it really intensifies their anti-state predilections. So really distances their identity from the national government and much closer to sort of the separatist thought. So that exposure to violence has been going on for decades, and there's been sort of new rounds of it. And one of the things we refer to in our report is, I think it's a J&K police report that was reported on in the Indian media, that recruitment for militancy came very close, both temporally and spatially, to where there were counter-militant operations. So essentially, people were being recruited after they saw people that were close to them or proximate to them in their locality being killed by security forces. In theory, treating militants is supposed to create political space for normal politics. But in this case, what it was doing was really galvanizing a resurgence in anti-state activity and beliefs. And so I think part of the problem has been that the state has never really figured out, like, what do you do after you kill people? Are they really effective at sort of ratcheting up these kill ratios? And even leading up to August 5th, there was a really good article talking about how the state is really talking about how effective they've been at eliminating terrorists. But beyond that, they haven't been able to offer a compelling political horizon to most Kashmiris. And the level of disaffection we're all speculating here because there hasn't been any survey work. But that's another, there are two ways to sort of measure that. One is if people just do broad-based surveys. And I used to ask Indian military officers who served in the valley and who were GOCs and various corps commands there, how do you know when there was a big sort of push to the winning the hearts and minds strategy and Operation Sadbhavana, how do you know that it's working? And they say, we know it's working because we're winning hearts and minds, because we're doing X, Y, and Z. We're creating public goods, we're providing security, we're distributing medical sort of supplies and money. And this is the same argument, frankly, that the United States used to say when it came to Iraq or Afghanistan. We're doing lots of things, but we don't really know how it's being received or how it's being interpreted by people on the ground. But when there are a few instances of people sort of studying what's actually sort of viewed from the ground, it wasn't actually working, it wasn't actually being received, it wasn't translating. And so that's something I think, if any government is really concerned about this, they would actually try to actively measure that. But I never found the military was trying to do it, at least, back in the mid 2000s and 5-10 years ago. But another measure of this is voting behavior, right? So the proof is in the pudding. If this big change is starting to generate real changes in political attitudes and beliefs about the future of the society and the state, you should see it measured in economic activity, right? So there should be sort of greater confidence from investors as well as business confidence. consumer confidence. You should see that activity start to pick up. And thus far, it hasn't happened. And there's all sort of big confounding variable, which is COVID. But if this is to work, that's supposed to take place. The second is you should see political participation in all levels, from local to state to national elections. And there, it just it remains to be seen what happens over the next few years. But one benchmark we should use is what was the political activity prior to the insurgency. So everyone looks at sort of the trend lines, what happened in the last election and where we are now. If you look at the last election, anything that's a minor improvement looks better. But really, we should be measuring it based on what happened in the voter turnout in the 1980s was the highest it's ever been. It outstripped the Valley, outstripped Jammu and Ladakh voter turnout. That's never been the case since then. So until you see, I don't think you can measure normalcy until you get to that point. That's a long way down the road.
Just to follow on, I do want to ask you a little bit, in your research, you talk about quasi-violence, and I'd like to know, at USIP, we talk about nonviolent action, and our program on nonviolent action looks at individuals and organizations facing restrictive, oppressive, or authoritarian forms of governance, and they can employ hundreds of nonviolent methods to amplify their voices and challenge the power dynamics and press for reform. So, I mean, we support this as a peaceful way to end oppression or to press for change, but how do you see this as different from what you define as quasi-violence? And many would argue in Kashmir that this is the only path they have to stand up to what they see as, state oppression.
Yeah, so this is we're still, I'd say, I'm still thinking about this. But look, there's always been sort of a history of nonviolent protest in Kashmir. There were bunds, hartals. There are lots of sort of unions that organize and do street protests and raise their voice and express their voice and discontent to the state. My sense is that didn't really get anywhere, and maybe it was the younger generation that decided that they were going to do something that was more assertive. They weren't going to take up the gun because that's basically a death sentence. The attrition rate of militants is very high. So they were taking up other forms of resistance, like throwing rocks. And something about the asymmetry inhibited maybe CRPF or police forces from just mowing these kids down as they could have if they chose to. So again, I believe there's some degree of restraint that sort of is part of this dynamic from the Indian government side. But nevertheless, this seemed like much more desperate. People were putting themselves in harm's way. There's really interesting articles. I mean, any sort of article that sort of depicts what like these interdiction sort of stories happen. A militant is holed up in a house. They're surrounded by security forces that are going in for an operation. There's a cordon laid around it, and people from the village just come out and start throwing rocks at them and trying to get in their way and physically interdict their ability to maneuver. And that's extremely dangerous. The civilians are putting their lives at risk. It's also basically tantamount to supporting a militant directly. It's direct material support. So it's a very strange place, but it does seem like this was widespread. It wasn't just a narrow set of people who were organized by the militants to be their overground workers. It seemed to be a broad base of people that was happening all over in the Kashmir Valley. And so that suggests to me that it was a new form of resistance. People find sort of meaning in that activity as much as they find sort of contributing effects to the resistance movement, and that I would think should be, in some ways, I think that was more alarming for the state. I mean, we quote one security official back in 2013 who says basically the sentiment here is such that if they all had access to guns, there would be a mass insurgency. And I heard that repeated a couple other times by security officials in the Valley, which is always, you hear very different opinions when you're in the Valley versus even in New Delhi from the same sort of people who are employed by the Indian government. And so that to me suggested that there's something deeply rotten in the body politic.
Thanks very much, Samir. Happymon, I don't want us to close this conversation without touching on opinions in the situation in Ladakh and in Jammu. Very briefly, with domicile law, with the standoff with China, if you can just very quickly, give us some insights on what it looks like 1 year out in the other parts of the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir.
Okay, I'm muting myself. Right. Thanks, Tamanna. I think it's important to sort of bring in the China angle when we are talking about Jammu and Kashmir today, not just because China has raised the Kashmir issue several times in the past, along with Pakistan in various international forums, but I think what may have actually created more of a problem now for India is the Chinese reactions to the Indian claim to Aksai Chin, as it were. So last year, when the Home Minister of India declared in the Indian Parliament that Aksai Chin is part of the erstwhile princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, there were very many adverse reactions from the Chinese side. So clearly, China has interest in the larger erstwhile princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, thanks, one, because of the Aksai Chin sort of angle, and also CPEC goes through the part of erstwhile Jammu and Kashmir, as it were. Now, I have argued in the past that the recent LAC standoff may have something to do with, at least in a proximate sense of the term, to do with the Indian claims about Aksai Chin, as it were. So you're probably looking at another party to the larger conflict in Jammu and Kashmir, especially in the in the greater Tibetan region, as it were. So I think that is clearly complicated, and certainly not in a positive sense of the term, complicated the Kashmir issue, Kashmir conflict or Kashmir dispute, as it were. Now, if you look at what is happening within Leh, it has its own politics. Ladakh, Leh thinks in a particular way, Kargil thinks in a particular way. If you actually look at some of the reactions from within Kargil, people weren't too happy about the constitutional changes, because they always believed that the Ladakhis basically dominated Kargilis, and there was this politics between these two sides. But the Ladakhis were clearly pretty happy about that. The situation in Jammu is interesting. Early on, soon after August last year, there was this jubilation by the local Jammuites about being mainstreamed into India. Now we are part of the larger Indian Union, as it were. Article 370 is gone. But I think slowly but steadily the reality has started seeping in. And the reality clearly is that the Jammuites have benefited from Article 370 as much as the Kashmiris have. They are not too keen on the so-called outsiders from Punjab or elsewhere coming into Jammu and settling down there and taking their jobs away and their opportunities away, as it were. So I think even the Jammu BJP has spoken about the need to have more thought about allowing outsiders to come and settle there and take their jobs. And that is why, if you look at the domicile law, the domicile law is a cleverly put together one. I mean, unlike a lot of what a lot of people think, there's going to be this en masse march of the outsiders into Jammu and Kashmir, and they will settle down there, and they will be given voting rights, and they will take away jobs. It's not that simple. I mean, anyone who has resided in Jammu and Kashmir for 15 years or has studied there for 7 years and appeared in the class 10 or class 12 examination can perhaps now apply for government jobs and buy land there, etc. So it's not that simple. It takes a lot of time. So there is no immediate threat to sort of the identity, as it were, as far as the Kashmiris are concerned. So I think you're right in sort of pointing towards the other aspects of the Kashmir conflict, as well. There is the Jammu bit there, there is the Leh bit there, and I think what is now complicating the whole scenario is the Chinese angle to the conflict. I think focusing only on Kashmir may actually prevent us from appreciating the bigger picture in some ways.
Thank you for that. There's so much more we could discuss. I really encourage the audience to read the two papers. There's a lot of good material there. I just want to end very quickly from both of you. We started off by talking about the dangers of re-escalation. There's no appetite for discussion. This doesn't paint a very rosy picture. What are the U.S. policy options? I mean, how can the USG prevent escalation between these nuclear armed states and try to address human rights violations and suppression of Kashmiris in the valley? Sorry, very quick, 2 minutes to each of you. Samir, why don't you go first?
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So I think they have to, first of all, we have to accept the fact that the United States doesn't have much influence or control over this process. We can offer, suggestions, insights, and try to broker sort of like discussions, but ultimately this is sort of this falls in the hands of the Indians and the Pakistanis and the Kashmiris, to the extent the Kashmiris are given a say or a vote. But I think that there are a few things we can do at the margins to express sort of, to lay down some markers about what we think is optimal and what can be most useful. So one of them is just encouraging dialogue. I think one of the things I think was arresting or alarming to people in Washington was not the choice of integrating Kashmirians or abrogating 370, but the lack of deliberation, the lack of sort of democratic deliberation, both within the state and outside, and a process and a timeline for that. It was a major political move. And I think United Democracy, it's incumbent to sort of bring people with you in that process. So the United States can express its concerns about that. It can encourage sort of continuing or resume dialogue with Kashmiri parties that Happymon that have been sidelined, as well as with the Pakistan government, because it's still at least viewed as a disputed territory, or there's certainly parts of the dispute that still exist, even if you think it's on the POK side as opposed to the Indian side. But I think the other thing is the United States can start to articulate the complications and the challenges that come from it. And I heard, I heard a very astute U.S. scholar talk about the issue that the United States is worried about with regards to India and the S-400 acquisition. I think the same kind of language can be applied here, right? India is free to make its own choices. It's an independent, very powerful, strong, thoughtful country. But if it chooses to go down a certain path, it's going to create complications for the United States. I think the foundations of the U.S.-India relationship have always been strategic primarily, but also economic, but also this idea that there's sort of a shared set of values and ideas. And to the degree that that gets eroded, doesn't change the relationship entirely, but it starts to erode the bases of support, the threads of support, particularly from members of Congress or certain communities in the country. But I also think it can affect the strategic calculus a little bit too. As I alluded to at the end of my talk, if India is truly bogged down in Kashmir, it really diverts capacity and resources to pivot elsewhere. As Happymon talked about, the challenges coming from China is much more intensified in recent years and frankly in recent months. And it's unclear that that sort of India's policies in Kashmir are helping it to sort of get past that and to reorient in another direction. So there's not much the U.S. can do in terms of incentive structures, but it can facilitate and it can clarify what the implications of choices are.
Thanks, Samir. And Happymon, I'll let you have the last word.
Right. Thanks. Very quickly, what I'll do is that I'll sort of, I want to focus a little bit on the potential for escalation between the two sides with regard to Kashmir, and also sort of come to the question that you asked about the role of the other parties, in particular the United States of America. And, if you actually look at some of the Indian reactions to terror attacks in Jammu and Kashmir in the recent past, I think they have been the Indian reaction has been very muted. And I think the reason why it has been muted is because these are low visibility attacks and haven't really had any political salience or significance within Indian domestic politics. But if the intensity or the visibility of these attacks go up, like it probably happened in Pulwama, I think the counterattacks by India, like it did in Balakot, cannot be ruled out. I mean, I think that's when the two sides could potentially get into an escalatory ladder, as it were. Now, the problem is that the Indian side has clearly learned that the traditional Pakistani argument about tactical nuclear weapons, that this and the other, is basically hogwash. I mean, that's not going to hold, and therefore there is enough space under the nuclear umbrella for India to carry out a conventional kinetic action and get away with that. Of course, the Pakistanis would react, but that is something the Indian side can sustain. Now, with that lesson learned, India potentially could, if there is a high visibility attack, get back at Pakistan. Now, on the other hand, the Pakistani side seems to be very emboldened by the LAC standard, the line of active control between India and China. The argument being that the Chinese have finally shown India its place and put India in its place in South Asia. Now, given the fact, and that may, I hope it doesn't, but that potentially could create a situation in Pakistan where they think that, hey, we have a situation where India is facing a nutcracker sort of a situation, and let's sort of try and do something on the line of control, as it were, along with China on the line of actual control. The problem with that strategy, I would argue, is that Modi has lost some face during the LAC standoff with China, in sort of April, May. Now, this loss of face will force him in some ways to react to Pakistan should the Pakistanis carry out or aid and abet a sort of high visibility attack in Jammu and Kashmir. So that's the sort of escalatory dynamics that we're looking at. But very briefly about what is it that other parties can do. I mean, traditionally, there was only one party in South Asia, and that was the United States of America. During the Kargil War, both sides sort of did listen to the Americans, and a certain diffusion did take place in the region. But today, I think, especially during the Balakot strikes, it was very clear that there were so many parties in the fray, from the Emiratis to the Russians to the Americans. There were too many parties in the fray, trying to diffuse the crisis. The problem today, I think, is that given the lack of sort of relative lack of interest that the Americans have in the region, and the entry of the Chinese into the region in a big way will complicate sort of any sort of third-party intervention or mediation between India and Pakistan in the region. Now, China will stand by Pakistan, and China may even try and offset the American sort of attempts at peace or mediation in the region. I think that China factor is going to complicate the traditional sort of framework that we had in South Asia, where the United States would come in, the two sides would listen to the United States, and sort of there would be a conflict crisis mitigation, as it were. I think that's something that needs to be seriously looked at. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're out of time, but I want to thank you, Happymon and Samir, for your great work in your papers and for joining us today for this discussion. We hope to continue looking at this conflict, which dominates really, all our thoughts about stability and security in South Asia. So please continue to join USIP for these discussions. I want to thank the audience for joining us and hope to see you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.